And it's for recording him. We are recording. We're on. Hi, everyone. Really excited to have this panel today. And I want to welcome all of our panelists and all of our viewers for coming out today, 4 o'clock at the Pacific time and 7 Eastern, to talk about, what's going on in education today and to see if we can find some solutions because we're really solutions based. And if you're streaming with us live on Facebook, then you're on the Jen and Heidi SEL page. And unfortunately, Jen is not here. I don't see her little box right there. She had a conflict because just like many of you, she's, teaching in the classroom and a lot of things happen and come up. And so there was an overlap with back to school night and this event. And so she was unable to be here for the entire thing, but we might see her pop in a little bit here and there. And so we will be able to engage with her when she does come in. I'm co-hosting this evening with Kelly Spino. And Kelly, I've known you for a little while now, a little over a year. We met when we were working on a project together, and we had another event similar to this presentation, but much bigger. And you are just a wealth of knowledge around education and how to support kids with a whole system, a whole child approach, starting with your special ed background and being in the classroom yourself, and then working with large organizations that support kids. So I'd love for you to say just a couple words about yourself and say hi to this group.
Thank you, Heidi. Well, I'm thrilled to be here this evening. As Heidi said, my background is in special ed. So that's where I began my career, and I've been a special education teacher, a principal, an executive with a nonprofit organization, and always an advocate for children that are either at risk or marginalized, and helping them to thrive in the educational arena. And so I'm really passionate about our topic tonight of how do we get education back on track so that all children can benefit and that we're educating the whole child.
Absolutely. And so when we decided to, bring this webinar or bring this panel discussion to y'all, it was birthed out of a conversation that Jen and I had with Kelly, and we had this vision. And for those of you who know Jen, she loves metaphors. And so she's always talking in metaphors. And we started thinking about, like, what are we going to call this? And like, what's happening right now? How are people feeling? And we're hearing just a lot of overwhelm and a lot of stress from people. Specifically, like, we just don't have time to come to your webinar. We don't have time to go to this event. I mean, I was supposed to be presenting at an event in October, and it got canceled because the administrators are overwhelmed, which that leads to having a really difficult time making decisions and processing information. It's like we're all just trying to survive right now. So in that, we decided to look at all the wildfires that were happening in the west of our country, and how that's kind of, fear-based and the sense of panic, and how that relates to this pandemic. And so we came up with the idea of after the fire. And I also like the thought of, like, in the fire, like, we're kind of in it still. We're not completely through it, but it will all settle at some point, and things aren't the same when they settle. A lot of people say, we'll go back to the way it was, or we have all these systems and policies in place, but are those the systems and policies that we need today? Because the world has completely changed. So yeah, Kelly, I'd love for you to share a little bit about your thoughts on that whole title that we came up with and how we came about it.
Sure. Well, when we began the discussion, we were really talking about this impact of COVID. And one of the things that we talked about was, as COVID was advancing on us, it simultaneously not only introduced new stressors to all of us, but it removed all of the comforts and connections that we had and all the routines that we were so familiar with, and not only in our own lives and our families and our communities. With so much loss with the virus and lost loved ones, there was all these concerns about health and safety and social isolation from one another. We had food insecurities, we had unemployment, we had unstable housing situations. And when this was happening, there was a sense of anxiety that also led to an increasing racial and political climate that seemed out of control. So on top of all that, we had the fact that our families and our communities were missing out on all those important events in our lives that we celebrate with one another. The holidays, the birthdays, the graduations and things like that. So it's kind of like that idea of the fire. When you ignite a fire and it spreads, it wipes out everything that you know. And so it destroys what's in its path. And not only does it do that, but it evokes this sense of fear. And of course, I always come from this neuropsychological component that says when there's fear, our response is safety. And our brain immediately goes to the fear center or the amygdala that says it's fight, flight, or freeze. And so when that happens, our hypothalamus gets in motion and it activates all these stress hormones in our bodies, and our emotional brain takes over. And in the midst of all that, we become dysregulated. Our systems become dysregulated. Our brain becomes overwhelmed with the toxicity of the stress. And it's not until we intervene that we can A, put out the fire and see what's left, or we can stop the emotions from running wild and begin to connect with our thinking brain. So much of this resonated with us when Jen and Heidi and I were talking about how this pandemic has really run just like a wildfire, and it's impacted every part of our lives. And so as we think about this, and as we thought about our schools had to quickly come up with a plan, because all those traditional structures that we knew and the systems, they weren't available anymore. And so one of the things that was really made sense to me, and I saw that alignment, was when Heidi was talking about something called a fire road. And growing up out west, I guess Heidi knows about this, where she was saying that they build these roads around like homes and things so that the fire can't get to them, or at least it puts a barrier there. And to me, that kind of reminded me of what our schools had to do, was they put a barrier in place, which was this pivot to remote learning, so that at least some kind of learning could continue. And so while this enabled our schools to keep working, some of our students weren't able to benefit. Some of our students only benefited partially from it, and some of them did really well. But we're not going to know the true outcome of the fire until we can get beyond the smoldering embers. And we're not going to know the outcome of this pandemic until we can really assess where our children are, and not where they are academically on a standardized test, but where are they in terms of their well-being, in terms of recovering from where they were where they were impacted. And so tonight, what I thought we could look at is, we now have an idea of some of the impact, whether it be a learning loss or whether it be this idea of social, emotional, mental health needs. So how do we move forward? How do we reimagine and reinvent our schools to create those learning environments that provide psychological safety, rethink those accountability metrics that we hold our schools to, include creativity and collaboration to foster higher cognitive skills and prepare students for these jobs of the future. So that's what we want to talk about tonight, is how do we make this happen? And we have a panel of experts to help us explore these topics and come up with some possible solutions to help you along the way. What do you think, Heidi?
Yeah, thank you for that rundown, Kelly. And I love the, the analogy of that fire, having lived through evacuations and close calls. I never had a situation where my town or my house was burnt down, but it did come very close. And I'm currently living in Oregon. I moved here just over a year ago, and driving back to California, or I live in Central Oregon, or driving to the West, both directions, is just complete devastation. Complete devastation. No one in those areas are going to go back to exactly the same thing that happened, that was before. They're not going to build exactly the same home, but they are rebuilding. They are rebuilding those towns. They are rebuilding their homes. They have the same land, but it's going to look different. And the biggest impact that I had as far as disasters was earthquake. And I had a neighbor whose house was completely flattened in the 1989 earthquake, in the Loma Prieta earthquake. And when they rebuilt a dome house because it was safer for earthquakes. So, taking what we've learned from this experience and finding the skills and strategies to use both in education and with rebuilding a home. So this analogy works really well when it comes to that, fight or flight thinking when it comes to the pandemic versus like, let's really sink into this and see where we can go from here. So I'd love to introduce our panel. We have Nick Rotoli. Hey, Nick, can you give us a wave there? And Nick he has 45 years in education. He's a 45-year veteran. He's been a high school principal. He taught English before he was an administrator, and 27 of those years were in admin, including assistant superintendent. And currently today, Nick is a professor and he supervises student teachers, which is amazing, Nick, because we need those strong teachers coming up in the ranks. We have Dwayne Arbogast. Dwayne, can you give us a wave there?
Hi.
And Kelly, could you do the intros for Dwayne, since you guys are colleagues?
My pleasure. So I've had the pleasure of working with Dwayne, and Dwayne has served in multiple capacities in both large urban and suburban settings. He is truly an innovator, both in instructional models, alternative programs, charter schools, turnaround schools, business partnerships, you name it, he can come up with it. And he'll have the metrics to go with it, I guarantee it. He's very much a systems thinker with excellent problem solving skills. He's the thinker you want on your team when you're trying to figure out a new way. Dwayne was also identified as a Washington Post Distinguished Leader in 2004 for his performance as an elementary school principal. And his school was named School of the Year by Exceptional Parenting Magazine in 2000 for successfully implementing a special education cluster site in a mainstreamed environment. So welcome, Dwayne, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Good evening, Kelly. Happy to be here.
We're glad to have you here with us, Dwayne. And Caroline is a new friend of mine. I met her through our mutual social emotional learning interests. And Caroline has been in education for how many years? 35?
Or 31.
31 years. All right, 31 years in education. She was in the classroom. She was director of special ed, and she was assistant director for a social emotional learning program within her school district, building it from the ground up. So an amazing resource in Caroline. I mean, she's done the work that we're all trying to do. She's had the pitfalls and she's learned from them and grown from them and helped the school district become extremely successful in that program. So thanks for joining us, Caroline.
Thank you, Heidi. I'm happy to be here.
And I see Jen popped in temporarily. Hi, Jen. We're just doing some introductions. We're about to introduce Frank Cross, and Kelly is going to do that intro.
All right.
You have something you'd like to say beforehand, Jen, since you have a moment here with us?
Yes, I'm very thrilled to be having this event. I think it's very, very much needed. I'm actually doing open house right now, and I'm in between classes. I have a lull, and it just goes to show that teachers are resilient and flexible.
There's the bell.
And we are looking for more opportunities to continue to support our profession.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. All right, back to introductions, Kelly.
All right, so I'd like to introduce you to Frank Cross, who's also a former colleague of mine. Frank is the president and founder of the Cross Learning Group. He is a career child advocate who has served as a child care worker, a child abuse investigator. He's worked as a children's home administrator, a consultant, a professor, an attorney, a writer, and a speaker. Busy man. In April of 2019, Frank started the Cross Learning Group, and through that, he offers professional development, coaching, and consulting. Frank was awarded the Maryland Governor's Citation for his presentation on suicide and the adolescent brain. He was the recipient of the 2019 Advocate of the Year Award for the Maryland State Council on Child Abuse and Neglect, and Maryland Essentials for Childhood. He has recently added the Master ACEs trainer to his bio, so congratulations on that, Frank. And in 2021, Governor Larry Hogan appointed Frank to Maryland's first ever Commission on Trauma-Informed Care. Frank is the co-author of 2 books. One is Creating the Upside Down Organization, Transforming Staff to Save Troubled Children, and The Upside Down Organization, Reinventing Group Care. So welcome, Frank, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, so I'd love to just jump into this discussion. And we had an opportunity to talk with each of our panelists beforehand and just kind of see where their passions are in education. And Nick, the conversation with you was a lot about what's happening with administrators right now during this pandemic and how it's like, you know, they need to have this 40,000 foot view from way up here, but they're looking at it from just 10 feet above, right? And so it's hard for them to see that whole picture. So my question for you today is that if you had a room full of district leaders and you could give them a magic clipboard with 3 points on it that you knew they would execute perfectly, what would you tell them?
Well, first, I'd like to point out what kind of drew me into this work. If we flash back to March of 2019, when all of a sudden schools had to dramatically shift their modalities, resulting in a dramatic shift for children, parents, educators. I thought that there was a tremendous opportunity lost when I thought this would be an excellent time to really focus on building community. No one knew what was going to happen next. I mean, we still really don't. We still don't know what the next month, 6 weeks, 2 months, flu season, how that's going to impact us. But I thought that instead of being in a constantly reactive mode to what's coming down from whatever, the state legislature, the federal government, that would have been a time to create a kind of, we're all in this together opportunity to build community. And the third point would be, so I would say first and foremost, build community, work on trust. I think there's a lot of damaged relations out there because of all the uncertainties and the way we've gone off in different directions than we thought we might have at time. So my emphasis would be on community and much more on social emotional learning, the well-being of our teachers, our children, our parents, instead of continuing the emphasis on standardized testing, which would have been there had none of this taken place. So it's like we're still pretending that we want to see the results on standardized testing and how our children, our schools are supposedly doing. But I think we're missing, the whole part of the iceberg that's below the water of the damage that this has all done to the learning process, to relationships, to going back to schooling as we once knew it before 2019. So those would be the points I'd emphasize. Community, community, community.
And building trust within that community. I really
Absolutely.
like that you approach that, and that you're talking about the need for social emotional learning. There's so much talk about that in education right now, yet there's a big lack of understanding around what that looks like, right? And I know that Caroline's going to address some of that later, and I will as well, and maybe some others will reach that topic. So I'm glad you brought that up. So Nick, if these leaders go and execute this community, and they really focus on that, what would that look like for you? What would be the ideal outcome?
Well, I think we haven't done as good of a job in education of listening as we could have done. You know, we all know as teachers, administrators, we're never able to solve every problem a parent, a teacher, a child brings to us. But I think especially in these circumstances, I would love to see the community invited in, students invited in a way that creates an environment where they're truly being listened to and heard, and listen to what their concerns are. And some of them may be very, very small, but I think we've moved to more of a we're going to wait and see and wait and hear mentality from, you know, those further up the chain of command, instead of creating these nurturing communities within our schools.
Yeah, and I know, just having spoken with most of the people in this panel, that resonates with a lot of us here. And I know that Jen and I, the work we do in schools is exactly what you're talking about, including all stakeholders and really listening and problem solving. We're very solutions based, right? And it's not just so simple as, okay, I heard you, now let's move on.
No.
I mean, I've been in schools where they were like, oh, let's hear your highs and your lows. And then, you know, I tell them my high, they're like, that's great. And then I tell them my low, and they're like, oh, too bad. And then I'm left like, ooh, you know, and there's like no follow-up with it.
Exactly.
It was
And
no-
that's really what Jen and I began working towards, to creating a model that we could bring to schools where that would foster active listening and problem solving with all stakeholders involved.
So all of us on this panel work with schools. Like, we work to support schools. We have, you know, some jobs that are like our main job, and then we're also consultants, or some of us are strictly consultants at this point in time. And we all want to do this work to support schools. Every single one of us is very passionate. I mean, myself, I jumped out of the classroom because I was frustrated with the system. I was frustrated with the things I was seeing, knowing what I know and not being able to get there. So I jumped out in order to help those schools, you know, who are looking for it, to make those changes in a more positive direction. And so that's why I do the work that I do today. And if I can find the schools that are doing that, I might consider going back into the classroom, because that's actually one of my favorite things to do, right? So anyway, knowing that we're all hungry to do this work, and we all want to work with schools, and knowing that there's a misunderstanding of what community and social emotional learning really is. Like, sometimes, for instance, I'll talk to administrators who say, yeah, well, our word of the week is kindness. We're doing SEL. And it's not that simple. So what word or phrasing might we look for to talk with administrators, and also for administrators to communicate with us, as far as looking for that, you know, solution or the pathway to finding this community?
My point of emphasis would be on being a good listener. We don't have a roadmap in place for how we're going to make up for everything that was lost, not only academically, obviously, but from a maturity standpoint, a social and emotional standpoint. And I think listening to the concerns of all, and then having the flexibility to devise a plan around that school and community's needs, because, you know, some school districts were set up for distance learning so that immediately nothing was lost. They could direct their families onto this platform that had always been in place for the instructional portion. But many, many districts lost months and are still barely treading water to just maintain an educational program. And so I think that's where I'd start, is understanding what the community, where the community is and what the community's concerns are: teachers, students, parents, and family members.
Nick, thank you for your 40,000 foot view.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it. And I hope it's helping some of our viewers, whether you're here live with us right now or you're watching the recorded version of this. Kelly, I'd like to move to you on the panel and hear what your thoughts are around, putting that all together. How do we work through the multi-tiered systems in the school? PBIS, I know you have some background in that as well.
Sure, and if we could use the video, the
Slide deck.
slide deck, thank you. That would be really helpful. So yeah, to follow up with what Nick was saying is that schools need to develop this plan based around the needs of that particular school and that community to address the impact of all of these changes. And one of the frameworks that we use in education, of course, is the multi-tiered system support. So this is the MTSS. And if we could go to the one, Heidi, with the triangle, that would be really helpful. So I think most people are familiar with this concept of the MTSS, in that schools develop this system that incorporates both the academic and the behavioral supports needed to ensure that they're meeting both academic and social emotional needs of the students and the population of their school. It was built around this concept of recovery and using data to match these needs in both the level system as well as the resources needed within each of those. So these guideposts are created to ensure that schools are allocating both their instructional and their behavioral interventions according to where they're most needed. With this comes some understandings that there's this general screening process. And oftentimes when we think about that, as Nick was relating to, we talk about those standardized test measures and looking at that academic profile of the school. And very few opportunities do we look at that behavioral profile, unless we're looking at suspensions and expulsions. But we rarely look at the strength-based behavioral attributes of the students that are in our schools. We also don't really have much information when it comes to this idea of the family involvement and the community partnerships when we think about this model. And so as we start looking at this reimagining, a couple things come to mind is that we need to kind of extend this viewpoint. Because as we are into this new school year, what we're beginning to think about is how are we crafting and implementing a comprehensive recovery plan for the academic, social, and emotional well-being of our children. And a couple things that have really come into the forefront when it comes to the MTSS is that our staff are suffering from either what they call compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. And we hear that they're burnt out. And we even heard Heidi say how this conference she was supposed to do for administrators, they don't have time. They have too much on their plate right now. And so think about the well-being of our staff and think about now the children that are coming back who are emotionally distressed. They're tired. They're chemically restrained from the stress hormones that are not allowing them to fully engage with that thinking and learning part of their brains. So as we think about this, we need to change our focus on this multi-tiered system from just academic attainment to the social emotional development. And as we heard Nick talk about the SEL component, it's really a prerequisite for learning skills. If we don't have the mental health in order for our children, they're not available to learn. And I think another point that Nick really talked about that resonated with me was this idea about relationships. And brain research tells us that every child needs one adult that's absolutely crazy, over the top, in love with them to have a healthy developing brain. And so when we think about the children coming back to us and we think about creating those healthy relationships, we have to look at what's going on in that universal or that tier one of our schools. We have to retrain our teachers to be able to fully understand, what does SEL mean? It isn't that checking in the morning and saying, hey, how you doing? Have a great day. I'll see you at the end of the day. Or spending 2 minutes to say that our word for the day is being kind. It's more than that. And it's not just always having a positive attitude, but we need to look at how do we combine our resources at that tier one. So when we look at our PBIS initiatives and we set our behavioral frameworks, are we incorporating the social emotional skills that we want our students to demonstrate? Are we incorporating our relationship building skills, our self-regulation skills that enable our students to become independent thinkers and independent learners? Are we incorporating this idea of psychological safety and creating a climate that allows children to engage in risk-taking in the learning environment? And all of that needs to happen at that universal level so that children can re-enter this world of learning with an absence of fear. That children can understand that the struggles and challenges they face can be understood and dealt with at the school level. We need to rethink our universal screeners so that we have a way to determine who are the children that are suffering. What does that traumatic impact look like? How do we measure it? How do we give teachers the strategies they need to be able to understand what happened to that child?
Kelly, thank you so much. And I love that you, you showed the connection between the health of the adults, the well-being of the adults, and the well-being of the children. I mean, they are interconnected. And it's not so simple as to just say, let's work on these kids. If the teachers are that stressed out, they're not there to be that one loving adult for those kids. And we know that the, younger children all the way up to the age of 25 to 27, their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed. So that self-regulating, although we can teach them the skills and strategies that help them grow that brain, they still need the adults in the room to help them regulate. And if those adults are not regulated, it trickles down. And I can tell you from my own experience in the classroom of very stressful environments, I know I wasn't giving to my capacity. I was still giving 150%, but I knew I could do better if I had a healthier environment to be in. And I love that you spoke about the trauma, because it is traumatic. What we're going through is traumatic for all of us. And we have Frank Cross here, who is an expert on that topic. Frank, you have a lot of experience around supporting children around trauma. And Kelly has a couple questions for you.
Yeah, so Frank, the first thing I'd like to ask you is, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of serving students with trauma in the classroom?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I pulled up my slide here real quick to hopefully give you a visual for this. And I think the most misunderstood part of working with trauma is adaptation. And so if you look at our bottom kind of journey, and we think about from conception all the way through adulthood, children have these pathways. And the one we want, of course, to give all of our children, if we can, is that bottom pathway. They have an experience primarily of safety, of predictability. And when children experience that through a lifetime, they develop people skills, the relationship skills you're talking about, the social emotional skills. They develop process skills, meaning they know how things work. They understand systems and processes, which is required from everything from getting your driver's license to applying for a job to doing for a job. And then maybe most importantly, they acquire possibility, this idea of visioning a future, looking way down the road and planning for it. And when that happens, when they get to adulthood, as long as those conditions where relationship and process and future vision matter, they're going to do really well. They're going to do really well. Now, let's take the top pathway, though, an alternative pathway where perhaps it's a dangerous, chaotic, unpredictable, traumatic kind of childhood. Well, you'll develop a very different set of skills because that's what's required in that environment. And the common ones, almost everybody has heard, fight, flight, freeze, because your focus is, as you said, Kelly, being safe, being protected in the moment. And so you develop those skills because that's what's needed for you to do well in that situation. And you continue into adulthood having really good skills in that area if you remain right in a unpredictable, chaotic, relatively dangerous or traumatic environment. Now, here's the misunderstanding. Let's say we take that adult or even that child, since we're talking about schools, that child who's developed in that safety network, and we put them in a situation where their school is not safe. It's maybe perhaps even dangerous. It's very unpredictable. I think we'd all agree that student's going to struggle. We can expect that there'll be some issues there. But what happens is when we take that child from the top pathway, who has those fight, flight, or freeze skills, and we put them in a safe school, a predictable school, right? What's misunderstood is, well, that child should just do great. No, that child is going to struggle also. It's the same thing. And the misunderstanding to me that can be hard is that child's not broken. That child's not maladaptive. That child adapted just like the child in the safe pathway. Yet we have different expectations. And that safe pathway we call good, and good students because they can sit in their chair and they can pay attention. But if you're from that unsafe pathway, sitting and focusing for a long time is actually just the opposite of the behavior you've developed, because you're going to get hurt, right? You're going to get hurt. Yet that child is quickly labeled, that child's quickly separated, that child quickly becomes the one we don't want to work with, we don't want to have in our classroom, etc. And that has been the case for decades and decades and decades. And I think it's because we misunderstand what trauma is going to look like and consequently what we need to do to respond.
Great. So Frank, can you talk about what this new reality might look like?
Yeah, and here's the new reality. And in the context of hearing you talk about the stress on teachers, which I appreciate, I think teachers, I think parents, I think families are enormously stressed. That doesn't change our new reality. And our new reality, and what's represented by the photo on the left, is 98% of the children who experience trauma will get no formal therapy for that trauma. Even though everything that you read is going to say the best thing we can do for those kids is get them into therapy, right? Because it's complex and it's really significant and severe. And so therapeutic intervention is needed. But for most kids, the vast majority of kids, that's not going to happen. They're not going to get therapy. And so what that means is the therapy then has to happen at home and it has to happen at school. And so when we talk about social emotional skills, and I love what Nick was talking about being reactive. We continue to be reactive to kids who have trauma, even though it's entirely predictable what we're going to see. And then part of that reaction is we don't change the system. And the system has to recognize and own the fact that most of the therapy kids are going to get is going to be in school or is going to be at home. And we have to develop those skills. So the social emotional skills that I know all of you, really focus on or are experts at in developing in kids have to be developed in staff, have to be developed in parents, because they're going to have to be, right, the providers of those therapeutic experiences kids have to get better.
So Frank, I think you raised so many great points, and I agree that not only do we have to develop these strategies in our staff, but as long as parents are co-teaching with us, either on a hybrid or in a virtual, whatever it might be, they too need to have these same skills. And I think that they too feel the very same pressures that our teachers are feeling. So do you have some strategies that you might recommend in order to meet some of the needs of children that are bringing trauma into the classroom?
Yeah, and I think the good news here is that there are a lot of practical things that can be done. And like any skill, we can learn them. And while I love the fact that we've really emphasized being trauma informed, our next step and what's required is to be trauma responsive. So how do we give our teachers those skills, and so they understand what the skills are, how to utilize them, and why they're needed is really key. So of course, not a comprehensive list, but I just wanted to give an idea that these are very practical. They're very practical. So if you have a child that's experienced trauma, one of the key features is make all feedback personal, and think of personal as one-to-one. So very unintentionally, one of the most damaging things teachers do with kids who have trauma is they post posters in the classroom and that show the stickers that the kids have earned, for example, for their behavior. And if I'm a kid from trauma, I'm always at the bottom. I'm not going to have made my stickers. I'm not going to have my privileges. And that's hard enough, right? But now you've published that to everybody else in the classroom and everybody who comes in the classroom. And because I'm very sensitive to threat and more physical, social, or emotional damage, or all three, that's not going to help me at all. That's going to increase my stress level. Stress level is already my problem. You unintentionally exacerbate the problem. Also, I'm the type of kid that saying to the whole class, in front of the whole class, Frank, you really need to do this, or that wasn't a good answer, or etc., or you need to calm down, isn't helpful. Very simple things like hand signals, using index cards, giving feedback that is silent is very, very effective. Secondly, no surprises. Kids from trauma don't like surprises, even if they're good surprises. Don't do it. Don't do it. So we want to give these kids a heads up, right, for things like fire drills, guest speakers, which might be considered positive, substitutes, especially substitutes, schedule changes, new seating arrangements, anything like that. We don't want them to be a surprise. We want lots of warning, because sudden change and transition are very problematic. We're going to have big emotions in your classroom. We're going to get angry. We're going to get frustrated, right? We're going to get sad. We're going to get anxious. And instead of reacting and being surprised or saying that doesn't belong here, we want to direct those big emotions, and we want to do it ahead of time so that kids are taught, if you get angry in my classroom, here's your choices, right? It's not that you can't get angry, because we will, but if you do, right, here's what you can do. And these are the boundaries of things that you're not allowed to do. So you get to choose, door A or door B with your anger, and I'll help you with that. But doing that ahead of time pays such big dividends. And then with all of us, one of the things that stresses us most is we feel like we don't have control. Mm-hmm. So even the smallest choices that you can give a student from trauma is going to make a big difference. So, hey, Frank, I'm going to be changing the seating arrangement. Is there a place in the classroom where you feel most safe? So that you have some choice in say in how that works. And then finally, structuring positive experiences. So the landmark study you mentioned in my introduction, the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, talks about how all of our adverse experiences add up. Right, it's in the science, it's something called allostatic load. They just weigh on us and continually make things more difficult. But those can be countered with positive experiences. And I think helping teachers structure for individual students these positive experiences that involve relationship, that involve success, that involve breaking things down, so I can feel like I'm making progress, vis-a-vis with my peers, which I'm always watching all of us do, could be very helpful. So some examples of some practical things we can do. And I think, in my work with teachers, particularly in this busy time and stressful time, things that are practical, they can use relatively immediately. They require, no special materials or special certification that work are very attractive. And I think they demonstrate that there's a lot that we can do to respond to the needs of kids from trauma in the classroom.
Great.
And Frank, since there's no surprises, I'd like you to know that you have a question from Marcus Legrand. Marcus is a board member in my hometown. And so when we get to the question and answer section, I'll make sure that you get that question. No surprises. All right, Frank?
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. So, there's been a lot of discussion around supporting the staff, supporting the teachers, so that we can bring all of what we have to those the students, the kids in our classroom. And I would like to shift on over to Caroline, because I know, Caroline, you and I had a big conversation around this before this panel, and we could have talked for days, you and I, on this stuff. So one of my questions for you is, can you tell me your thoughts on the current state of the climate that you're feeling in school systems right now?
Thank you, Heidi. Yes, we could have talked for hours, I think, about that. What I'm seeing is almost, you could almost create a T-chart out of what's going on with climate at schools right now for both kids and teachers and administrators. I think for the adults, if you look at what are some of the things that are really stressful, we've got people in survival mode because we've got, huge staff shortages going on right now. We have students coming in with trauma and teachers who have not got the training or the background, who tend to sometimes personalize behaviors. And that makes it really hard for them to be able to be objective about what's going on and do exactly what Frank was just describing, and be able to really put some systems in place to help those kids. We've also got teachers who are struggling with their own social and emotional well-being. As many of you have said, we've all experienced the trauma of COVID. We've all experienced what's going on in our society right now with the social unrest that's happening. And Kelly mentioned earlier that, and I think also Frank did, or yeah, the whole idea of fight, flight, and freeze. And there is a fourth F that is flock. And I think what we're seeing a lot of right now are people really gravitating towards groups that are like them. And it's creating a lot of division between groups of people, because people tend to go when they're feeling under stress or they're feeling threatened. They tend to go and find their tribe. And we're having a really hard time communicating with each other because of that as well. So that's happening. And then meanwhile, we've got kids who are trying to, if they have ever had a normal school experience in their past years of schooling, they're trying to re-access all of those social skills that they had built over time. And I saw this amazing graphic the other day that said kindergartners, first graders, and second graders have yet to have a normal school year, if you think about the timing of all this. So you've got a group of little ones who have no idea. When we say, oh, we might go back to the new normal, they don't even know what that means, right? So there's just a lot of stressors going on. But what I also see and what I also hear is a great amount of hope and a great amount of joy. Teachers are so happy to have their kids back in class this year. Kids are happy to be back with their friends. And even though it's still not, it's not a normal situation, it's not a totally safe situation, I think that health-wise, mental health-wise, them being able to be back together again is giving people a lot of hope. So, there's both sides of the coin, and I think just recognizing that is super important. I can't, Heidi, you're muted.
It's still happening.
I do it too.
One of the other things that we had talked about, and I love that you're pointing out like both sides of the coin, was that, part of creating this safe climate right now is to really focus on positivity. And I'm a huge proponent of gratitude, for instance. Like when I moved from California to Oregon, I focused on gratitude to really help lift me up. However, that's not the only side of the coin. And so, we're hearing about a lot of schools trying to stay positive. Can you tell me your thoughts on that? Like what that looks like, how we do that, how that's most beneficial for us in schools to keep our climate up?
Yeah, and I think, educators are notorious for creating new buzzwords. And so the latest one I've heard around that is toxic positivity. And it's a real thing. And I think it goes back to, I think really what Nick was saying earlier about that, the importance of building community and building trust. And one of the things that I did with my team that I got really frequent feedback that they were grateful for, going back to the idea of gratitude, is that I would always acknowledge the stuff that wasn't great, you know, and when they came to me and said, oh, this is happening and this is happening, and I'm really angry about this, I'm really upset about that, just acknowledging people's feelings. Listening was a big part of what Nick was talking about. And really actively listening to people involves acknowledging where they're coming from, acknowledging what they're saying to you, not just doing a temperature check and somebody's on the red and you go, okay, well, now let's get into our agenda. We need to take the time with folks to really acknowledge where they are. And if we need to spend time with them individually to really dig into that a little bit and ask them in a private moment, keep it personal, I think is what Frank said, that's going to be super important. So it's important to have hope. It's important to be positive. But if you don't acknowledge the real stuff that's happening with people and the real feelings that they're having, it seems very disingenuous to folks.
Yes, Nick, let's hear what you have to say about it.
I use the raise hand feature on my just following up with what Caroline is saying and expanding on that a little bit. I think we have what I would call trust and information gaps. Like, I don't think parents believe that school districts are telling them everything that they know or everything that might be happening. I don't think that teachers believe that the school district, the upper administration, is telling them everything that they know or everything possible. There's often gaps between what the upper administration and what the school board it knows or shares. So just by closing some of those gaps with honesty, as Caroline said, it's not all rainbows and sunshine, but honesty would go a long way to building community and trust.
Thank you, Nick. And I agree with that 100,000%. It's being honest and transparent. And there is a dearth of that in our school systems, you know, and I think that we really need that. If we're going to say we believe in social and emotional learning, and it goes back to what Kelly said, it's a universal proactive practice. It involves every level of our school system. And if you're not able to model that from way up high, there's not going to be trust built. So it's everybody's responsibility, I think, to make that happen.
Thank you, everyone. And yeah, I actually, this is kind of my piece and I want to dovetail right into it. But I don't want to miss this word, this phrase that you gave me the other day that I had never heard before. You gave me this phrase of mutual care, because we hear administrators telling their teachers, you know, take self-care, do this for yourself, do that for yourself, but they don't give them the time to do it, number one, and maybe they don't have the skill set. So can you tell me just real short, real quick, so that we can make sure we have time for Dwayne? We want to hear what he has to say. What mutual care is to you?
Well, for me, self-care, it's way more, first of all, than just going and getting a massage or, going shopping or doing something like that. But it also feels sometimes like a burden to people when you say you need to take care of yourself, you need to engage in self-care, and you feel like you don't have any time. So there are ways that you can build mutual care into a school community. And one of those would be to build time in you could do community building circles where teachers have an opportunity to do what we were just talking about, be able to really share what's on their heart and on their mind, in an environment where there is acceptance and openness and honesty and transparency. You can have teachers have a mutual care buddy where they just kind of look out for each other and maybe make a self-care plan that each of them can hold the other accountable for. We've done that many times in our school district. And it helps to know that there's somebody who's just got your back and there's somebody who cares about what happens with you. And it's also, I think, as far as the administrators are concerned and the bosses of our administrators, the bosses of our principals, to really work with them on what do you need? What are your needs right now? And you may not be able to solve it as an individual, but if you have a group of people coming together and saying, how can we help each other? How can we get all of our needs met so that we can hold it together for our kids? You're gonna have more buy-in, and you're gonna have more belief that people actually do care about me. This isn't all on me. So that's kind of what it means in my book.
Absolutely. Thank you, Caroline. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about what SEL is, because as we mentioned earlier, it's another buzzword. We are really good at buzzwords, Caroline. We have a lot of them. And our buzzwords are these days becoming political. They're dividing us. And so I find often when I'm talking to administrators, they don't even know what SEL is in the true sense of it. It's a behavior, right? It's an embodiment of a perspective. It's a way of living. It's a way of being. And so, what all of us do as consultants is we go into these schools and we support the learning and the understanding and the embodiment of this behavior, so that when we interact with one another, whether the staff is interacting, whether we're interacting with parents or with children, we have this embodiment of all the social skills we need, all the emotional skills we need in order to have positive relationships. And that's what it's really about. It's not about bringing a curriculum. I mean, sure, there is curriculum out there and there's great curriculum out there, but that's just the beginning. That's just a seed. Right. And so it's really creating this culture and this climate, and to implement it properly, it takes years. It's not the next shiny thing. It's not a quick fix. You can't adopt it and the next year say, well, it didn't work, we're dumping it. You'll never succeed. You'll just keep spinning your wheels. So that's why people like us who consult can go into schools. We have the expertise, we have the knowledge. We can do a lot of that thinking for those guys who are on the hamster wheel right now, right? We can totally support that so that they can get where they need to be. They can solve those problems right now, even though they're feeling overwhelmed. We're there to relieve them. And the other thing that I hear frequently from administrators is, I don't have the funding for it, right? There's funds everywhere, but you just got to know where to look and how to get it. And that's when we go to Dwayne, because Dwayne is so innovative around this. He's innovative around a lot of things, but particularly finding ways to, bring in programming and bring in structures into school systems. So I know Kelly has some questions for you, Dwayne. I'm so excited to hear how we can pull this off.
So, I think the big question, Dwayne, you've heard us talking about these resources and trainings and consultations that are needed in the school setting. How do the schools and the districts get the funding they need? Where does it come from? How do they access it? Can you share with us a little bit of what that funding stream might look like and how one might go about accessing those funds?
Absolutely. And Kelly, can you put up the screen? And I'll try to move through this pretty quickly. I have some good news and some bad news. And I want to talk a little bit about ESSER and ESSA. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So ESSER is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Act. And a lot of you know it as CARES and the American Recovery Act. And what they did was the educational part of the CARES Act and the supplemental and of the American Recovery was funneled through something called ESSER. And as you can see on this screen, between the three funding sources in the last 18 months, we're looking at almost $200 billion. Okay, you want to go to the next one, please? So the funds are distributed to state agencies, and then the state agencies give it to the local districts, and then the local districts tell the principals how to spend it. Now, here's the bad news. The bad news is that as it moves through these funnels, people forget how flexible these dollars are. And they're actually quite flexible. And the federal government and all the conversations with people on the Hill gave a lot of flexibility to the to these dollars. But large bureaucracies, and Nick will know this, tend to go for expedience. It's much easier to buy 1,000 Chromebooks than it is to implement an SEL curriculum in your school. The ESSER funds have been allocated. I have a link here. This is the National Conference for State Legislators. It's a great place to show how each state says they're going to spend their money. But I have to tell you, SEL is a significant part of virtually every state's plan. The money must be spent not by this September or next September. It's actually over the next 24 months, the money has to be spent. But I also want to let your listeners know there are two other pots of money. One is the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund called the GEAR grants. And there's even more flexibility in a GEAR grant than there is in the ESSER funds. And there's also an emergency assistance for non-public schools. So if any of our listeners are working in schools that are not public schools, there are still opportunities for you as well. Next slide, please. So what's the intent of ESSER? One, the safe return of schools. So you're going to see a lot of money spent on PPEs, and you're going to see air filters and that kind of thing about COVID in particular. And you're also going to see dollars around distance learning. But here's the critical part. There's language in there called equitable services for children, and they want to guarantee the physical, mental, and social emotional needs of students. And they want to provide mental health supports and address learning loss, and then do after-school programming. What I'm finding is most school systems are focusing on learning loss and spending the money on tutoring and paying teachers to tutor. But the language is really clear that mental and social emotional health and mental health supports are a significant part of this. So, key points. School districts don't want to add staff for mental health because they're afraid that in 2 years the money goes away, so they'll have to cut the positions. And they've spent all this money on tutoring. So what I would suggest to people who might be listening to this is, number one, use the money to build teacher capacity. Consider startup programs. So Kelly, you talked about MTSS. MTSS is actually mentioned in the legislation. Use these dollars for startup and then think about sustainability. Consider contractual relationships. This goes to Nick's point about community. This is the perfect place to involve community-based organizations. So if it's the Boys and Girls Club, or if it's a mental health provider, call them. The money is there. Even if you don't have the staff to implement it, they do. Next slide. The last piece I want to talk about is ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. And this is a Biden proposal, and these are your title dollars. And Biden is proposing a change in Title I dollars from $15 billion to $45 billion. And in that language, you're going to see increases in counseling, school-wide tier interventions, MTSS, exactly, Kelly, what you talked about is in the legislation, and support for targeted assistance schools. So schools that have struggled with academic performance in the past, there's a lot of money flowing to build these cultures. So this is a real opportunity. Title II is the teacher professional development. There's not a lot in Title II related to SEL, but some pieces can be carved out in dealing with students with emotional problems. The one that's most interesting to me is Title IV, student support and academic enrichment. There's a lot of money that in Title IV that can support SEL implementation. And there's also language around the 21st century community learning centers. Included in the ESSA money is an increase in community schools from 30 million to 400 million. So schools that have high concentrations of poverty, working with community-based organizations to provide mental health, you're going to see an increase in that. ESSA has not been reauthorized. They're waiting for the infrastructure bill and the debt reconciliation. I do expect those to be passed probably in the next 30 to 60 days, and then you'll see the authorization of ESSA. ESSA will last longer than the ESSER dollars. So for those people in the audience who are working with school principals or are school principals, there is money out there and more money coming. So they just have to be very strategic in how they use it.
Is the funding available now for districts?
Yeah, so what happened was the plans were submitted this summer. School and local school districts submitted their plans. What's happening is a building principal might have said, I'm going to spend $30 million on tutoring. But what they're finding is they can't even find tutors, and they're spending $2 million and not $30 million. So the repositioning of money is possible. It's simply a request back to their administration, but they're feeling like the money is very restricted, but in reality, it's not restricted. And requests can go back to the local district and back to the state, and should be honored. So you just have to be persistent and strategic with how you're using that money.
Great.
Excellent.
What I heard from you, Dwayne, is that this SEL piece that we have talked about tonight, it's not only is it imperative to the academic achievement in setting the prerequisites in place so children are available for learning, but there's actually funding that's available to support these initiatives.
It's
So
specifically
hiring
called out.
contractors such as us to come in and help support them is definitely something that would be supported by this funding.
It's specifically listed in the legislation. So
Great.
yes.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you.
And Kelly, all of us have skill sets that are different from one another, and yet we have some overlaps. And as an individual consultant myself, that's why I like to work on teams and I like to collaborate with other SEL folk. And that's how I know all of you. That's how I end up working with Jen. I do a lot of close work with Jen. So yeah, I want to thank you all for taking the time to come on here and share your thoughts with our audience. And I know we had a couple of people viewing live. This is also recorded, so we will be sending that out, and all the panelists here will be given a copy so they can send it out to their people as well. And so here's the list of our panelists. We have Dwayne, and Dwayne's contact information is right there, along with Frank and Caroline and Nick. And then of course, your host, that's me, Heidi Marlinghouse, along with Kelly and Jennifer Osger. It was nice to have her do a little cameo there. But I want to open it up to the question and answer portion. I know that we have several people in the viewing in the Facebook stream right now. And we do have that one question still from Marcus Legrand, and it was directed towards Frank around trauma. And Frank, he sent a little more information to kind of, give you an idea of why he asked this question. So he says, Marcus Legrand is a big advocate for students of color. And he says, students of color have far more traumatic situations than most students, and many of the issues are around microaggressions, white supremacist systems, and untrained teachers to help interrupt. And he says, so his question is, where does critical consciousness and social action come into play with trauma?
Yeah, so I would say when we look at it's a very complex question, but when we look at trauma, the definition of trauma, I think is an important place to start because it means different things to different people. So the definition I like, it has three components or three boxes. One is exposure to highly threatening or harmful events. Number two is your brain has this extreme stress response. Traumatic stress, toxic stress are often the words used for it. And then in the end, you have these changes, right, to your stress system, your nervous system, your learning systems, et cetera, that affect you socially and physically and emotionally. So with Marcus's question, what that takes me back is to box number one, because discrimination, those microaggressions, the major pieces that aren't even micro, macroaggressions in some cases that kids of color face, certainly raise that stress level and certainly provide a level of stress that's different from other types of stresses that kids who are not of color don't experience. And I certainly would agree, Marcus, that is a substantial and significant stressor. In terms of the interventions for it, I think the social action, the social change, the awareness, the implicit bias, all of those efforts are enormously important. Cultural awareness, etc., are enormously important, so we can stop the event, right? That's creating the stress. In terms of the help with to and for the kids who experience that, I go back to Carolyn's comments about positivity, because what's integrated into Carolyn's comments is that we have to be honest about that damage. And I think that as soon as kids are developmentally able, that we talk to them openly about that damage and about that stress, and give them strategies and techniques to manage that in the moment the best they can, particularly when it comes to microaggressions. So a great question. Certainly, I think more and more research is coming out almost daily on historical trauma and racial trauma, gender trauma, sexual orientation trauma, and significant issues for us to address.
Thank you, Frank. And it doesn't look like we have any further questions coming up, but if any of our panelists have questions for one another, because I know there was a lot of, crossing topics together, I'm happy to open that up to you guys if you have a question. Otherwise, we can close things down. It's about 8:10 Eastern and 5:10 Pacific.
I'd like to say thanks for including me and such wonderful company.
Thank you, Nick. It was great to be here with you, and a really intellectual conversation around schools and what they need right now. I think it was really informative. So I appreciate everyone for bringing their piece.
Thank you, everyone, for being part of this and enlightening all of us on how we might move forward.
All right, we're going to close down for today. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.